"There's a man in the small conference room," my assistant said, "and he looks like he's going to be sick." At 9:58 on a Tuesday morning in Greensboro, I set down my coffee and looked at the calendar I already knew by heart. One meeting. A distressed apparel brand seeking rescue capital. The founder had insisted, twice, on meeting the anonymous buyer face-to-face before he'd sign. I had read his file the way I read all of them. Numbers first, names second. The name second was Grant Mercer. I did not tell anyone in my building that I had once spent 7 years waiting for that man to marry me. I did not tell them that he'd married someone else in 90 days instead. I straightened the thin silver bracelet on my wrist, the one he'd given me a lifetime ago, the one I'd pushed to the back of a drawer the week he left and only started wearing again last spring. Then I picked up my folder. My name was on the deal as principal, RMH Holdings. He didn't know RMH was me. He was about to. "Tell him I'll be right in," I said. I did not smile. I had stopped rehearsing this moment years ago. "My name is Lena Marsh. I'm 45 years old, and I own the largest independent contract sewing operation in the Carolinas. 4 factories, 610 employees, and a holding company quiet enough that most of the brands who depend on us have no idea whose name is on their checks. But 11 years ago, I was none of that. I was 34, working 3 jobs. Days at a bridal alteration shop, evenings hemming for a dry cleaner, nights sewing costumes for a community theater that paid in checks that sometimes bounced. I had $400, a rented room, and a man who kept telling me next spring. Welcome to her silent triumph. Get comfortable. Every woman in these stories was underestimated by someone who should have known better. Hit that like button and tell me where you're watching from. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met Grant Mercer in a fabric warehouse the spring I turned 27. Both of us reaching for the same bolt of Italian wool. He was charming in the way that costs nothing and promises everything. He designed menswear. Beautiful work, I'll give him that. And he talked about the label he was going to build the way other men talk about children they already love. I was a seamstress, with fast hands and a good eye. And when he found out I could turn his sketches into real garments overnight, he looked at me like I was oxygen. For a while, I was. I sewed his first sample line in my rented room, the machine bolted to a card table, the bulb swinging when the upstairs neighbor walked heavy. He'd come by at midnight with cheap wine and big plans. When the label takes off, he'd say, "We'll get married in the spring. You'll run the atelier. Mercer and Marsh." He gave me a thin silver bracelet that second winter. Nothing expensive. A band so light you'd forget it was there. A placeholder, he called it. Until I can do it right. I wore it every day. I believed in placeholders. I believed that if I just kept my hands moving, the life he described would arrive on schedule. So I worked. 3 jobs, because his label ate money and made none. I paid for the sample fabrics. I paid for the trade show booth. When a buyer from a department store wanted 200 finished pieces in 3 weeks, I sewed until my fingers bled through the thimble. And I taught 2 women from my building to help. And we made the deadline. Grant took the meeting, in a suit I'd tailored. Grant shook the hands. I stayed in the workroom. Every spring he had a reason. The label wasn't ready. The timing was wrong. His investors were skittish. I told myself patience was a kind of love. And I had a great deal of love. So I had a great deal of patience. I was 34 the last spring I waited. I had a folder of wedding ideas I never showed anyone, and a bracelet worn smooth at the clasp. I
I thought I was building a life with a man. I was building a business, for one. I just hadn't put my own name on it yet. The end came the way his springs always came. Quietly, and then all at once. That March, Grant's label finally got its money. A real investor. 6 figures. The break he'd promised for years. I remember the night he told me. I thought, finally the spring we'd been waiting for. What I didn't know was that the investor came with a daughter. Her name was Sloane Ashford, 26, and her father's checkbook was the oxygen Grant had been looking for all along. I found out the way you find out the worst things, sideways, from someone who assumed I already knew. A fabric rep congratulated me on Grant's engagement. I laughed, because it had to be a mistake. Grant and I weren't engaged. Grant and I were next spring. He didn't deny it when I asked. That was the part that undid me. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "Lena, be reasonable," he said, in the workroom, surrounded by the samples I'd sewn with my own hands. "This is the opportunity. Her father can take the label global. You and I, we were always more of a working thing. You know that." A working thing. 7 years. 3 jobs. The fabric I'd paid for out of a checking account that never held more than $400. The bracelet on my wrist that he'd called a placeholder. He married her 90 days later. 90. I counted, because counting was the only thing that kept me from screaming. 7 years of next spring. And he found his actual spring in 3 months. The moment a richer one walked in.
He kept the label, my patterns, my grading, the 2 women I'd trained, the buyer relationship I'd built. He kept all of it, because none of it had my name on it. I had been so busy proving my love that I'd forgotten to prove my ownership. When I walked out of that workroom, I owned exactly what I'd walked in with 7 years earlier. A sewing machine, $400, and a thin silver bracelet I no longer had any reason to wear. I went home to my rented room. I took the bracelet off and held it in my fist until the edges left marks. I didn't throw it away. I didn't know yet what it was. Evidence, maybe, of how long I'd been willing to wait for someone else's spring. I set it on the windowsill, where I'd have to look at it. Then I sat down at my card table, and for the first time in 7 years, I sketched something with my own name on the label. The first year alone was an arithmetic of subtraction, and I was very good at arithmetic by then. I lost the room within 4 months. The rent went up and my hours went down, because Grant, it turned out, had quietly told the bridal shop owner, a friend of his new father-in-law, that I was difficult. Word travels in a small garment town. 2 of my 3 jobs dried up inside a season. So I did what I knew how to do. I found more. At 35, I was working 3 again, then sometimes 4. Days doing alterations at a chain tailor for $9 an hour. Evenings behind the counter at a fabric store, folding bolts I used to buy. Nights, and I mean deep nights, taking in piecework, hemming, mending, whatever came, on the same machine bolted to the same card table, in a new rented room smaller than the last. I slept in pieces. I ate standing up. There was a stretch that winter where I lived on rice and the free coffee at the fabric store, and I sewed until my hands cramped into claws I had to soak in warm water to open. I want to be honest about the bottom, because people romanticize it later. It was not noble. It was cold, and it was frightening. And there were nights I sat on the floor with my back against the radiator and did the math on how a person just stops. I was 35, single, no children, no savings, no name on anything, in a town where the man who'd spent 7 years of my life was being written up in the local paper as an up-and-coming designer. But no children meant something I didn't appreciate until later. There was no one whose breakfast depended on me pretending to be okay. My collapse, if I had one, would be mine alone. And somewhere in that cold room, I made a small, furious decision. If I was going to sew until my hands bled, I would never again do it to build a life with someone else's name on the door. I didn't have a plan yet. I had a machine, a skill nobody could take back, and a rage that had finally gone quiet enough to listen to. That's the year I started keeping every receipt, every yard of fabric, every hour, every invoice. Not because I had money, because I had finally learned what it costs to build something you don't own. They call the middle years the quiet ones. Mine were quiet the way a sewing room is quiet, full of small, relentless motion that adds up to something only if you don't stop. I made myself one rule that first cold spring. One thing forward every week that had my name on it. One thing, however small. Some weeks it was registering a business name. More sewing. The least imaginative name in the Carolinas, and the proudest I've ever been of 2 words. Some weeks it was learning the part of the work I'd never been allowed near. Costing, grading for production, how a purchase order actually becomes money, how a contract protects the person who signs it.
Because here's the thing I'd learned the hard way. For 7 years, I had been the hands, and Grant had been the name, and the name is what owns the work. I was done being hands. I was going to be a name. I took the piecework and I turned it slowly into contract sewing. A local uniform company needed overflow capacity. I did it flawlessly and on time, and I put it in writing, every term, every deadline. Then a second client. Then I hired the first of the women who would stay with me for a decade, Iris from my old building, who could run a machine like she was born at it. We worked out of a rented unit behind a tire shop. 3 machines, then 5, then 9. There was a night that second winter. Marsh Sewing was 8 months old, and I had $1,100 in the business account and a payroll of $1,900 due on Friday. I sat at my kitchen table doing the arithmetic that never worked, and I opened the drawer looking for the utility bill, and my hand found the muslin scrap instead. The bracelet. Thin, silver, worn smooth at the clasp. 7 years of next spring, coiled in a bit of cloth. I held it for a long time. A pawn shop 2 blocks over would have given me $30 for it, maybe $40. $40 was not payroll, but it was something. And I was a woman who had learned to make something out of $40. I didn't sell it. I want to tell you it was sentiment, but it wasn't. Not really. I looked at that bracelet and I understood, finally, exactly what it was. The price of waiting for someone else to decide my life was worth committing to. And I decided I would not sell that lesson for $40. I would keep it where I could find it. And I would not wear it. Not until the day I could put it on for a reason I chose, in a life that was entirely my own.
I wrapped it back in the muslin and pushed it to the very back of the drawer. When it's mine, I said, to no one. If you've been listening for a while, do me one quick favor. Subscribe It costs you nothing and means everything. Meanwhile, across town, I heard things. You always hear things in a garment town. Mercer & Co. had gone global, just like Sloane's father promised. For a while. But a label built on someone else's patterns runs out of patterns. The buzz got quieter. The department store buyer I'd once sewn 200 pieces for in 3 weeks dropped the line. I heard the quality had slipped after some staff changes. I knew exactly which staff. Me. The 2 women I'd trained had drifted away when Grant couldn't make payroll. Grant was a designer who had never learned the unglamorous half of the business. Because for 7 years, the unglamorous half had been me. I did not celebrate. I was too busy. But I did notice, the way you notice weather, that the man who'd called me a working thing was slowly discovering what happens to a label when the working thing walks out the door. By the time Marsh Sewing turned 4, I had 30 employees and $200,000 in annual revenue and a reputation among brands for one thing. If you gave Lena Marsh a deadline and a spec, the work came back perfect, on time, no drama, no excuses. In an industry full of grants, I had become the rarest thing there was, the person who actually delivers. I didn't know it yet, but I was building the exact door he would one day have to walk through. I was just building it with my own name over the frame. Here is how a seamstress becomes the person who decides. You start by being the best at the thing everyone thinks is beneath them. Contract sewing is invisible work. The brands get the magazine covers. The factory gets a check and a non-disclosure agreement. For years, I was fine with invisible, because invisible was safe, and I had learned to distrust the spotlight. The spotlight was where Grant lived. But invisible has power, if you understand it. I could see every brand's real numbers, their margins, their reorder rates, which labels were healthy and which were quietly dying. I sewed for 40 companies. I knew before their own founders admitted it, which ones were 3 bad seasons from the end. Marsh Sewing became Marsh Manufacturing. 9 machines became 100. 1 unit behind a tire shop became a real factory off Interstate 40. Then a second across the line in South Carolina. I stopped taking every job and started choosing. And around year 7 of my own company, the same number of years I'd once wasted, I made the move that changed everything. A children's wear brand I sewed for was going under. Good product, terrible management, drowning in debt. The founder came to me in tears, hoping I'd forgive what she owed. Instead, I offered to buy it. The name, the patterns, the customer list, for a fair price that cleared her debts and let her walk away whole. I folded it into my operation, fixed the management, and within 18 months it was profitable. I had discovered the other side of the table. For years, I had been the hands that build value for someone else's name. Now I could buy the name. I set up a holding company to do it quietly. I called it RMH Holdings. The letters didn't stand for anything a stranger could trace, just 3 initials that meant something only to me. RMH would identify distressed apparel brands, acquire them discreetly, keep the workers, cut the ego, and run them on the unglamorous discipline I'd learned in a cold room on rice and free coffee. We never put my face on it. Founders in trouble are proud. They'll take a rescue from a faceless firm more easily than charity from a person.
The anonymity wasn't a trick. It was mercy. I remembered exactly what it was to be too proud to be pitied. By 44, I owned 4 factories, 600 employees, and a portfolio of brands you've probably worn without ever seeing my name. I was the largest independent contract manufacturer in the Carolinas and the quiet buyer of last resort for labels running out of road. I want to be clear about the leverage in this story, because you're waiting for the part where I make him pay. The leverage is not a weapon. The leverage is simply this. I had become the person who decides which failing brands get a second life, and on what terms. Fair terms. Terms I write. For 11 years, I had lived and died by other people's decisions. Grant's, the landlord's, the bridal shop owner who called me difficult. Now the decisions ran through me. I never once went looking for his name. I didn't have to. In a business that eats its founders, I just had to keep the lights on and wait for the road to run out under the people who'd once run me over. One Monday in October, a new file crossed my desk. A distressed menswear label, 11 years old, out of cash, seeking rescue capital or an outright buyer. My analyst had flagged it as a possible acquisition. The brand was called Mercer & Co. I read the founder's name twice, and the floor of the factory I'd built with my own 2 hands tilted, just once, the way that workroom had tilted 11 years before.
I sat with the Mercer & Co. file open and did the math a person does in a moment like that. Grant Mercer, 51 now. The label that Sloane's father had taken global had come apart the way I always knew it would. Beautiful clothes, no spine underneath. There'd been a divorce. Sloane and her father's money had exited years ago, which meant Grant had spent the back half of his 40s doing what I'd done in my 30s, except he'd never learned how. He'd remortgaged, borrowed, remortgaged again. The label owed money to 3 factories, a fabric mill, and a bank that had stopped returning his calls. And now Mercer & Co. was on the market, or begging for rescue capital, whichever came first. The materials had been sent, blind, to a short list of buyers. One of them was RMH Holdings. Me. He had, without knowing it, put his life's work on my desk and asked me to decide. Here is the thing nobody tells you about becoming the person who decides. You spend your worst years rehearsing the speech. You picture the exact moment his face understands. And then the moment is actually in front of you, in a manila folder, and every rehearsal turns to ash. Because it's just numbers now, and a room full of people whose jobs depend on those numbers. And somewhere under the debt, 40 garment workers who did nothing wrong and would lose everything if the label folded. I never wanted revenge. I wanted my life back. So I stopped waiting and I went to work. I went to work the only way that had ever saved me. I followed the process. I had my team run Mercer & Co. exactly the way we ran every target. No more scrutiny, no less. The verdict was unsentimental. The brand name still had value. The debt was survivable if restructured. The workers were good. The founder was the problem. On the pure economics, it was a viable acquisition at a low price, with one standard condition RMH places on every rescue where the founder is the point of failure: the founder exits. It would have been the same recommendation if the label were called anything else. He'd get that offer if his name were Smith. He would not get $1 more because it was Mercer. And this was the harder promise I made to myself in the factory bathroom with my hands shaking. He would not get $1 less. I would not underpay his workers' futures to punish him. The math would be fair, because fair was the whole point of everything I'd built. There was only one wrinkle. Grant had done the one thing I never expected. He'd refused to sign anything until he met the principal behind RMH in person. Pride, probably. The same pride that made him take meetings in suits I'd tailored while I stayed in the workroom. He wanted to look the money in the eye. Fine, I thought. Look me in the eye. I put the meeting on the calendar. I did not tell him who he'd be meeting. And on the morning of it, for the first time in 11 years, I opened the muslin scrap at the back of my drawer and took out the thin silver bracelet. It was mine now. Not a placeholder, not a receipt. Mine. I put it on because I'd promised myself I only would when the life was entirely my own. And it was. I wasn't wearing it for him. I'd half forgotten he'd be in the room until my assistant said there was a man in the small conference room who looked like he was going to be sick. You already know that part. Let me tell you what happened next. I walked into the small conference room the way I walk into every deal meeting. Folder squared, chair pulled out without ceremony, coffee I wouldn't drink set to my right. Grant stood when I entered. It's automatic for men like him. They stand for money. He had his pitch smile ready, the one I'd watched him use on buyers for 7 years. And then he looked at my face, and the smile did something slow and complicated, like a garment coming apart at a seam you can't quite see yet. "Oh, Lena?" he said. "Mr. Mercer," I said. "Please, sit."
He didn't sit. He stood there in a jacket that had been expensive 2 seasons ago, in a room in a building I owned, and I watched him try to assemble a version of reality in which this made sense. "You're RMH?" "I'm the principal, yes." I opened the folder. "Thank you for coming in. I know these meetings aren't easy. Let's talk about your company." I meant it. I had decided somewhere on the drive in exactly who was going to be in that chair. The principal of RMH, not the woman from the workroom. So I did the thing I do. I walked him through his own numbers, calmly, the way I'd want someone to do for me on the worst day of my professional life. The debt, the mill he owed, the 3 factories, the 40 workers. I did not raise my voice. I did not sharpen a single word. He barely heard the numbers. He was looking at me the way you look at a room you used to live in. "You built this," he said. "All of this. How?" "One deadline at a time," I said, and moved on to the terms. The offer was fair, more than fair. It cleared his debts, protected every one of his 40 workers, and kept the Mercer & Co. name alive under RMH. 11 years earlier, he had left me with $400 and a machine. The paper on the table between us now was worth $11 million. It contained the one standard condition. He would be paid a transition fee and then exit the company entirely. RMH does not keep founders who ran a brand into the ground. That clause is in every deal. It was in his. "You're buying my company," he said slowly, "and removing me from it." "I'm buying a company that can't make payroll," I said, "and saving the 40 people who still can't afford for it to fold. Yes, the founder exits. That term isn't personal. It's on every deal I do." I slid the sheet across the table. "You're welcome to take it to another buyer, but you sent your file to a short list, Grant. And I guess you already know I'm the last name on it still answering."
He didn't take the sheet. He was somewhere else. 7 years, he said, quietly, almost to himself. I said nothing. This was the moment 11 years of nights had been pointing at, and I discovered I had no speech left. The speeches had all burned off somewhere around year 4. in a cold room over rice. There was nothing to say to him that was truer than the building we were sitting in. So I let the silence do the work, and I reached across the table to turn the sheet toward the signature line. That's when he saw it. The thin silver bracelet slid down my wrist as I extended my hand. The band he'd given me in a rented room a lifetime ago, worn smooth at the clasp, sitting now against the cuff of a woman who signed for 4 factories. He knew it instantly. Of course he did. He'd bought it. He'd called it a placeholder. His face came apart at that invisible seam, all at once. "You kept it," he said. There was nothing left in his voice. "After everything you kept it." I looked at him. I did not cover my wrist, and I did not hold it up. I had put it on that morning for me, not for him, and I would not now turn it into a weapon by explaining it. Whatever he was doing across that table, the arithmetic of 11 years, the slow understanding of exactly what he'd traded and exactly who he'd traded it away from, he was doing on his own. I hadn't said a word about it. I never would. He understood then, not because I told him, because he finally saw the whole of it, sitting on my wrist in a building with my initials on the door. RMH. He'd spent the meeting wondering what the letters stood for. I watched him get there, and I let him. I never confirmed a thing. Some receipts you don't read aloud. You just let the other person recognize their own handwriting.
"Take the offer to your lawyer," I said gently, standing. "It's a good offer." I gathered my folder. "My team will handle everything from here." He was still looking at the bracelet when I reached the door. "Lena," he said, "The transition fee is generous," I said. "Use it well. Your workers are going to be fine. That's the part that matters." And I left, because the conversation was over, and I had not raised my voice once. And the only triumphant thing in that room was a thin silver band I'd finally earned the right to wear. Mercer & Co. sold to RMH Holdings 3 weeks later. Grant signed. Of course he signed. It was the only offer standing, and it was a good one. His 40 workers kept their jobs. The mill got paid. The name lives on today as a small, healthy line inside a company he'll never be allowed to run. He took his transition fee and left the industry. I hear he sells real estate now, 2 states over. I hope he's all right. I mean that more than he'd believe. I saw him one last time, in the lobby, on the day the papers closed. He'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. He stopped in front of me, and this time he got the sentence out. "I'm sorry, Lena, for all of it. The 7 years, the way I did it, calling you." He couldn't say it. "I've thought about it more than you'll ever know. I waited to feel the thing I'd rehearsed feeling for 11 years. The click of a debt paid. The warm rush of a wound finally closing. It didn't come."
Because an apology is not a time machine. He could say sorry 1,000 ways, and it would not give me back the 7 years I spent sowing a life for a man who was always going to marry the richer Spring. It would not return the nights on the floor against the radiator, or the hands that still ache when the weather turns, or the children I might have had in some other version of those years, and simply quietly didn't. I don't say that with grief anymore. I say it the way you name a true thing. Those years are gone. You don't get them back. Nobody hands them to you at the end with an apology stapled on top. "I believe you," I said. And I did. "I'm glad your workers are safe. I mean that with everything I had.
Then I told him the last true thing I had, and it wasn't for him. I stopped being angry a long time ago, Grant. Not for your sake. Anger is a full-time job, and I was busy building one of my own. So I stopped giving you the hours. I glanced at the lobby, the name over the desk, the life. That's not the same as it not costing me. It cost me everything I had at 34. I just built something on the other side of the bill, and I put my own name on it this time. He had no answer. There wasn't one. Take care of yourself, I said. And I went back upstairs, because there was a new file on my desk, and a factory full of people whose Friday depended on me. I drove home that evening to a house I own outright, with a workroom off the kitchen where I still sew, by hand, for no one but myself. Iris, who ran a machine in a unit behind a tire shop with me 20 years ago, runs my South Carolina factory now. We don't talk about Grant. We never needed to. She watched me build the whole thing. The watching was its own kind of witness. I stood at my workroom window a while, and I turned the thin silver bracelet on my wrist. Worn every day now. Out of the drawer for good.
I used to think this was a story about the day he needed me and didn't know it was me. It isn't. That meeting was just a Tuesday. The real story was all the quiet years before it. The rice, the radiator, the receipts I kept when I had no money. The 2 words, Marsh Sewing, I was prouder of than any wedding. Nobody filmed those. Nobody clapped. That's where the whole thing was won. If a man ever spends your best years promising a spring that only comes for someone richer, here's what I learned sewing my way back. The goal was never to make him pay. The goal was to build a life so wholly mine that when he finally showed up needing something, the worst thing I could possibly do to him was simply be who I'd become and do my job fairly with his old placeholder on my wrist. He gave me a bracelet and called it a promise. I kept it and made it a receipt, paid in full. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.